Hi, I'm Carola Boehm. I'm a professor of creative and cultural industries at Staffordshire University, and I'm going to talk about University 3.0 and Gibbons 3.0 and what this actually all means for HCI and music, or those are the questions that I'm probably going to be asking at the end of that. So just really short, the structure of this talk, I'm just going to really short say three things about myself, but I'm going to go heavily into co-production because we're living now in the era of co-production, and I'm going to introduce a model that helps me to sort of clear my head in relation to where university policies are in terms of innovation systems. And then, of course, at the end, hopefully we can have a good discussion of what this all means for human-computer interaction and music. So 3 things about me. So you can see this is me, or it's not me. An avatar of me, actually, so you can already tell that I love my creative tech, and you'll probably be seeing some of this in the next slide. I studied music engineering and computer science, so in my past lives, I worked on MPEG-7, music information systems, performing arts data services. I've done the podcast thing, but in more recent times, I've actually looked at the role that arts plays in higher education to make universities more permeable. So I wrote a book on arts in academia and the role that arts plays in civic universities, and civic universities being much more general, any university that has a civic agenda, like all universities nowadays. So my research currently is much more about these larger systemic things. And the last thing to know about me is that I blend my virtual with real through technology, and not just, not just since COVID. I basically live like probably so many of us in a physical digital mashup of reality. And so these mashups are often within virtual communities that co-create the environment for learning or for living or for producing audio or for being creative, both at work and play. So I feel that these communities co-create the spaces that I tend to inhabit. And I think that sort of aspect of co-creation is really important to me, and it will also be a key theme of this talk. And on the picture, of course, on the left, you can see at the bottom and the top, I'm actually, I run very, very slowly, but at the bottom, of course, I run virtually in a virtual world. And, in the top picture, I run in the real world, but professionally, of course, whether that's keynote talks or whether that's live workshops in a setting, there's always a sort of blended thing with technology. So I do actually love that very much. So let's just talk about co-creation a bit, because I would suggest that despite artists having a long historic tradition of forming collectives and co-creative processes, individualism is still often emphasized as the highest concept associated with freedom and quality. So there's a neoliberal tendency to elevate the individual and the individually identifiable creator. And I would suggest that this has established a perceived meritocratic society of individual power and choice. And I would also suggest that the current multiple crises of governance, of society, the environment, and the economy point to a dead end on this trajectory. So perhaps as a result, current discourses on more collective, cooperative, or collaborative endeavors is on the rise. So I feel the era of co-creation and co-production has truly begun. And I think words matter in here, and we can see that the discourses are increasing, that it is a shift away from high individualism towards more collective and collaborative. And I think the arts here are the canary in the coal mine. They really sense when a shift is happening. And so we see emerging terms being used more and more again. Community music, had its ups and downs, and community arts as well, but it's coming in strong again. Participatory arts, cultural democracy, everyday creativity. And I can see that that signifies a shift. And just to give you an example of that shift, I want to quote a report considering co-creation from 2021 by the Heart of Glass and Battersea Art Centre. And the quote is, "There has been a move from discourses about the democratization of culture to more expansive discussions about cultural democracy." specifically in terms of supporting everyone's cultural capability and the substantive freedom to co-create versions of culture. So this quote juxtaposes two terms, democratization of culture and cultural democracy. And just in a nutshell, democratization of culture is about let's get everyone into the concert halls, and cultural democracy is, in a nutshell, let's fund where creativity happens, be it street dance, be it mural art, be it rap or local music community center. And why this is important is because co-creation supports cultural democracy, and with that, it addresses inequalities. So I think that we can see that specifically during this time when the divide between the rich and the poor has widened, models using co-creation, co-ownership and co-production have become much more important during this time. So again, going back to this Considering Co-Creation report, it suggests that there is a growing appetite to interrogate notions of power, both in the formation and delivery of projects, but also in the structures we rely upon to support cultural practices. There is a wider demand, in our opinion, for a deeper level of connection and collaboration, and a much broader sense of who gets to be part of the making of meaning and where that meaning takes form and how it can affect change, both personal and at a community and structural level. So of course, as an example, many of you will know that this is the example from the April Fool's Day last year in Reddit, our place, where every person who logged on was able to do 1 pixel per 5 minutes of a color using a color palette of 16 colors. And so that it was even, the structure of that, or the algorithms afforded you to collaborate online in larger groups to really be able to do something more substantial on this canvas, which existed for, a week. And then they changed the palette to being all white, one color after the other, and it suddenly faded into whiteness, which we're going to see in just a second. So this is a time rougher. There you go. But there are other examples, again, how these terms are really on the increase. So for instance, in European Union activities, but also in European cities that want to use culture-led regeneration, they mention co-creation increasingly as part of their policies, as part of their processes. And the European Union itself, in the last two research frameworks, Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe. So that's the last 10 years of research. They've encouraged consortia to really use open innovation models. And you can see Open Innovation 2.0 is the last sort of square there, which focuses on innovation networks, ecosystem-centric, cross-organizational innovation. So it is innovation moving out of the lab, and co-creation is a key element of that. And even in music technology or music production, we see the discourses increasing in relation to that. So we see, last year, Robert Wilsmer and Christopher Johnson published a book on co-production in music production, or collaboration in music production. And they put forward a taxonomy, that you could look at group co-production, internal co-production, co-production without consent, and deproduction. But it's a really interesting book to really understand collaboration in that field. So all of that points towards that there is a cultural shift, and it points towards a growing and nuanced understanding of how we are as humans collaborate, how we see ourselves both as individuals and as part of a collective entity, and that happens also at different scales. So the collective entity could be groups with common interests, it could be neighborhoods, it could be humanity as a whole. And that points also towards this concept put forward by Luigi Sacco, Culture 3.0, which is a model of cultural engagement, how cultural engagement has evolved. So in a nutshell, Culture 3.0 types of cultural engagements are characteristic of constantly shifting roles of content producers and users. Culture no longer an aspect of free time use, but entrenched in fabric of daily life. There are no predominant market channel bottlenecks. There's a blurring of active and passive participation, and it's much more about everyday creative living. Sorry, I just have a cough here. So with that, of course, it connects to all dimensions of civic functioning. It can be more impactful. It impacts on innovation and welfare, on sustainability and social cohesion, lifelong learning, social entrepreneurship, local identity, and soft power. So it's more impactful, and it's also much more immersive. And here just some examples of that. In top right, again, I am rowing a running avatar in a virtual running environment. So I hooked up my indoor rower with some gadgets to my iPad running Swift. But at the bottom, of course, is a much more well-known example, Destiny, massive collaborative gaming, where there's by now much more content being produced by users rather than by the developers themselves. So it is really in that space, in between 2.0 and 3.0. And the left example, I always have to say that you can have sort of this type of immersion or culture 3.0 types of cultural engagement also without technology. So you think about street festivals that really allow audiences to participate. So I was part of the Lost Carnival in 2017. I was there as an audience member. But the whole event, which lasted, 2 nights, 3 days, you camped there, created a story together with the audiences, which was there. And of course, there was music and dance and food trucks and everything. So it's much more immersive. And I do always say that podcast is a good example in terms of understanding Culture 3.0. So also with the underlying technology. And just to mention, because I jumped ahead with Culture 3.0, so that's that model. Luigi Sacco, of course, goes from the sort of cultural evolution of Culture 1.0. If you think patronage, if you think 18th century aristocracy funding concerts, flute concerts, you're in the right place. But of course, it happens also in modern times, like public patronage with the proms. But again, it absorbs value because the costs of putting on something like that cannot be met with just the ticket sales alone. So it absorbs value from other areas where it has to be invested into. Culture 2.0, think copyright, think IPR, think the music industry, think the film industry. You're in the right ballpark. And why that's important is because Luigi Sacco has always suggested that Europe is hung up on Culture 1.0. And because we fund Culture 1.0 so much in Europe, it holds us back as a society in terms of innovation potential and economic productivity. Whereas I've always suggested that the UK is hung up on Culture 2.0. So we will actually see in just a minute that I think that the creative industry strategy is very much about Culture 2.0, and that's holding us back in terms of productivity to a certain extent. So as I said, Culture 3.0, co-creative and immersive. And for us, of course, the questions will be, what does this mean for the HCI and the music research community? And with that comes this tension within an intersection of knowledge production processes, co-production and higher education policy driving innovation. And to get my head clear in relation to that, I've come up with a sort of new model, University 3.0, which I'm going to introduce in a second. But before we do, why do we need that? And on the right, there's, of course, it was an infographic which was distributed quite widely, specifically after Brexit, that the wealth divide between the poorest and the richest in Britain is the biggest in North Europe. So yes, we have the richest city, which is London, but we also have 9 of the poorest areas, which are all outside of London in Britain. So for the government, of course, it raises questions of, okay, what levers can they pull? Of course, and that's the levelling up agenda. Before levelling up, it was the big society agenda. Can we do something to attend to that? Which levers can we pull? And of course, universities have been caught right in the center of that, because universities are, of course, distributed throughout the country. So if governments don't want to fund local authorities, universities are the entities that might be able to pull the levers. And of course, in recent years, universities have increasingly been tasked to take ownership for growing economic productivity, for increasing social mobility, for solving the challenge of our failing school system, meeting the increasing expectations of student consumers, reducing immigration, because of course we cut international student incoming numbers, and doing all that with minimal public funding and simultaneously being increasingly forced to allow market forces to regulate their work, because of course this has also worked so well in other sectors. And I always sort of liken that it's almost like swimming in a competitive shark tank with hands and feet bound. So yes, we're supposed to be the marketized oriented sector where competition drives prices down for the student consumer. But actually, we have one of the heaviest regulatory burdens of any kind of financial sector, so it is really hands and feet bound. But of course, I should say that I do believe in universities holding, being the key anchor institutions of our regions. And we also have the magic glue, which is arts and culture, which allows us to be more impactful than any other sector. And just thinking about what the government has put forward in terms of the lever, so you will remember just before we all went into lockdown, the industry strategy was published. And of course, all of these numbers are completely moot. It's just absolutely sad to see these numbers now, because of course, the COVID ripped through the creative industries. But of course, they were immensely successful just before COVID. But one of the difficulties in terms of the industrial strategy was that it still focused on culture 2.0 types of activities. It still wanted to build the next Hollywood in London or the next Nashville in Glasgow, and just seeing it as an opportunity to have IP industries and copyright industries in relation to that. This is just a slide, I don't have to go into it, but how COVID ripped through the creative industries, with music, for instance, having turnover losses of around 50%. Radio did a bit better, games didn't have any, was much more resilient, actually. But of course, COVID, specifically in live practices, just ripped completely through it. And this is what the government published in terms of its creative sector deal. So you can see that the imagery very much points towards a sort of culture 2.0 model. And I'm not saying that that is necessarily a bad thing. There's still a lot of money to be made with culture 2.0 business models, but I think it needs to be balanced with culture 3.0 business models, because it allows much more impact, much more accessibility, less gatekeeping, less extraction to the top to actually happen. So where are we? And stepping back in terms of our innovation programs, this is, I guess, where we were maybe 20 years ago. We were completely perceived as the ivory tower. And this was a cartoon that I used during that time, actually. And of course, a lot has changed, or has it? If I would be a bit cynical, I would say, okay, we added another door, we put on another sign, welcome to our enterprise zone. We all now have incubation spaces and innovation hubs. We have individuals who attend to this area. However, it's not quite as impactful as we would hope. And of course, that's why the impact agendas, whether that's civic university agendas and impact agendas in research, are affording us to engage much more with our regions than ever before. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But there have been these increasing higher education discourses in relation to just this question of, what are universities for? How can we be more engaged? Can we, the contention between the private and the public university? Is there such a thing as a beneficial, impactful private university? There's the question of conscience, so ethicalness of the universities and with their surrounding communities. There are questions about attending to democratic deficits through our universities. The campaign for the defense of public universities arrived as well, defending vehemently the public role that universities have, and that is, of course, endangered by marketizing the heck out of it. cooperative, ownership models come out, and also what is a good university. And as the last one, my little contribution, the book Arts in Academia, the role of arts in civic universities, where I really attend to the question of, how do we use arts to make universities much more permeable? And of course, for me, it is really the magic glue. But there are in these discourses these tensions. On the one hand, public university, regional impact, civic universities. On the other hand, higher education market, students as consumers, internationalization and globalization. And I think HCI in music or any kind of music technology developments, sitting within the music industry, sitting within communities as well, is torn within these tensions. So it's really useful to understand that. And, we always wonder as academics why we feel so frazzled. And this is just a slide that I picked up from one of my colleagues who talked about the role of universities in global knowledge economies and the fact that they are now required to report to so many different kinds of regulatory frameworks and agencies. So it's no surprise that we in the sector feel put upon and unduly influenced in all sorts of directions. But of course, as I mentioned before, for various governments, universities who are distributed throughout the country are almost the only public levers left that they can pull. And I would say arts and culture fits into that category as well. So arts and culture in universities is immensely important. But something else, of course, has happened as well. Why are we in that stage where we are? If we look back 20 to 30 years, the world seemed to be easier, was it? Yes, in some ways it was. So if you look at these different spheres from academia, industry, and government, and this comes from a discussion in the book, classic book of Edskowitz, from the Triple Helix, you see that every sphere had its very specific function. So academia was there only for teaching and learning and had the human capital and did basic research. Industry was only there as a place of production, vocational training, venture capital. And government was only there for regulatory activities, maybe some basic research and development funding and business support. But of course, that has been muddled up quite a lot. So universities nowadays are afforded in their role of industry to stimulate development of new businesses. And of course, we have innovation zones and incubation hubs in relation to that. In industry, businesses develop training to ever higher levels. If you think about the higher degree apprenticeships, which businesses are involved in quite substantially. And of course, the government acts as a public venture capitalist through research grants and studentships. Just think of KTPs and CHIME programs. So because it's so much muddled, it's very easy when you do partnerships to really not understand what your roles are. And this is where, of course, Edskowitz came in 2008, and he comes from a business sector and put forward a sort of university, industry, government recognized model that allows one to manage the interactions between these different helixes, and with that be able to manage innovation and socio-economic development. And I discussed that in terms of applying it to the music sector. So I wrote a paper in 2015 that really takes that into that sphere. And of course, Edskowitz, because he was a business academic, he forgot about the fourth helix. He forgot about the notion that there is such a thing as society, that there is such a thing as civil society. And that was a few years later added by Karianis. And certainly in my project, and this is just one example of one of my projects, so we have been funded since 10 years by the European Regional Development Fund to develop the creative industry sector in North Staffordshire. And we have a typical quadruple helix innovation model involved with 2 local authorities. We, of course, get money from the European Commission. We have 2 universities involved, 4 enterprises, and then 2 distinct regional communities and individual citizens. And with that, we put in a program that supports the whole creative sector in our area. So these helix partnerships are really important, but the fourth helix, I think, is really vital and has emerged as being seen to be really vital. The whole civic university debate has, it's just a debate that started over the last 7 years or so. And it has, really increased quite substantially, so that most universities have now a civic university agreement, And of course, for me, again, there's a magic pocket knife, the arts. And for the government, though, it is, of course, a welcoming thing that universities need to take on civic responsibilities, because, to some extent, it's again a lever that they can push. So here I put in, this is several years old, but a Guardian article: can a university rescue a city when the local authority fails? And if we're not funding and investing in local authorities, then, universities are almost the only anchor institutions left of that size that can really make inroads. With that, knowledge production, so research, has evolved and needs to evolve. So again, apologies to those who, this is bread and butter, it's a classic book. Gibbons, 1994, put forward mode 1 type of research, or mode 2 type of research, or knowledge production systems. And they have their own characteristics, with mode 1 having linear innovation, discoveries within the discipline, in mode 2 being more problem solving, much more reflexivity. And when you look at mode 1, what is the quality indicators? It's peer review and research excellence. And in mode 2, it's rather a community of practitioners who might deem something useful. So these are really two key types of ways of producing knowledge. And of course, you can already tell that in mode 2, there's much more co-creation involved, because you need to take the community of practitioners with you as such. And this was expanded a few later, again by Carianders, into mode 3, which is a sort of reflexive mode, being able to switch between mode 1 and mode 2 much more easily. But why this is important is because, of course, there are frictions between mode 1 and mode 2. And these frictions are also inherent in current higher education policy. So if we take the last two research assessment frameworks, you can see that there is a friction between mode 1 and mode 2. Mode 1 being represented by the public output that you put into the ref, and the impact case studies representing mode 2. And of course, we know that we hear the words peer review and research excellence left, right, and center. So we see that we're still very much in mode 1, but also evidenced by the fact that in the last ref, output still counted for 50%, whereas impact only counted for 25%. So although we think we should be actually in mode 2, we're still very much beholden in mode 1. And I think this matters. It matters also to the HCI community and the music, music technology community, because I think mode 1 pushes us back always into rather having brownie points for people publishing papers, rather than working with communities or producing gadgets or spin-out companies. So the amount of innovative gadgets I've seen lying on the shelves of various PhD student rooms or staff who, through their systems, had to hunt after the brownie points of publications, public output, rather than create these spin-out companies and spin-out opportunities. And there are universities which do that well, but there are, it could be actually more. That's actually afforded by the system that we have, which still sort of forecounts that. And so in order for me to be able to talk about that a bit more clearly is that I used my own sort of conceptualization of this evolutionary journey from University 1.0 to University 3.0. And in this conceptualization, 1.0 represents more predominantly those periods and institutional cultures associated with this inherent perception of knowledge ownership. So including modern aspects of institutional owned IP and copyright, knowledge patronage, Gibbons mode 1 and linear research rules. And of course, typical teaching practices include processes that represent a knowledge exchange from those employed within the institution to those who aren't, such as large lectures. So in my past life, I also taught acoustics, 20, 30 years ago. The internet was only beginning to be a big thing. So, I was probably, besides the library and expensive books, I was probably the key source of knowledge. So if I talked about audio technology or digital audio or dithering, this is where you got it from. But nowadays, of course, there's no need for me to say that. People can just look it up themselves. So University 2.0 moves into the era of massification of higher education, and that's characterized by expanding and fragmenting knowledge domains and the use of metrics to personalize mass-produced and marketed learner products. And so we see the emergence of quality assurance products like validations, standardization of content like QAA benchmark statements, and concepts around students as consumers and universities as businesses. But a key aspect remains that knowledge is central. And so we as academics were curating the knowledge for our learners as we navigated these fragmented fields of content and the fragmentation of knowledge resulting out of expanding knowledge fields. So that's, of course, University 2.0, and terms come out that are being mentioned there, as, of course, students as consumers quite often, and it still has linear research roots. So I would though suggest that we in the sector are now entering an era of University 3.0, and I do feel that this is not very well understood by current policymakers, and that also quality assurance systems are holding us back pulling us back into University 2.0. But University 3.0 is becoming more a process of curation, a curation of interfaces between knowledge and society. So the quality of a learning environment is becoming more important than specified and static learning content. And higher education providers are becoming more permeable, and learners and researchers more often co-own and co-produce and co-create. And of course, for University 3.0, partnerships are absolutely essential. So within the learning, within learning in a knowledge society, there are these different roles of universities and their place in the society, but we just, we don't transmit knowledge anymore. Like from University 1.0, we don't only curate knowledge anymore, University 2.0, but we move very fast towards curating learning environments where the focus is on learning environments where we don't own the knowledge, we're more permeable. We, that is all learners and all researchers, co-own, co-produce and co-create. And for this, again, as I mentioned, we need partnerships. And of course, again, arts is a vital mediator between universities and their surrounding communities. So that allows us to be more permeable and porous. So that was the end of that. And of course, questions for the HCI community that we can then discuss out of that is actually, if we think that co-creation is so important for impactful knowledge production, how do we drive HCI and music community to move into the space? Is it already happening? Where are there open doors and where do we need to push through? And the other question I would have is then, so what does University 3.0, which is a focus on the learning environment, so not the knowledge content, what does University 3.0 offer the learner, the researcher in the HCI music community? So what does it mean in this community to move away from knowledge ownership, University 1.0, and also move away from knowledge curation, University 2.0, to focusing on learning environments, University 3.0. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to close this, and I'm hoping we're having a good discussion.